I just wanted to make very brief video, making just a few comments on this issue of the use of images in the history of the church, because Gavin Ortlund did a video, pretty extensive, lengthy video on the history of the use of images, and then there was a much longer video put out by Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin discussing this issue and trying to rebut the video of Dr. Ortlund. Now, I haven't watched the entirety of their video, so I'm not going to give an extensive rebuttal of their video. That's not the point of this. But I did watch some of it, and I've looked at some of the discourse that's going on online surrounding this issue, and I just wanted to make a couple comments about it. Now, first of all, I've done a lot of reading on this question. It's been a while since I've done reading on this question. This is something that I had explored quite a bit when I was writing my book Christification, because I was reading a lot of Eastern Orthodox sources. And I enjoy reading Eastern Orthodox sources on a number of issues. And when I was doing that, I was exploring the issue of iconography a little bit and the place of icons and their spirituality, just because I was reading some Orthodox sources and wanted to have more familiarity with that. So while I was doing that, I did a bit of exploring in some church fathers and the history of the church to say, well, how did the early church treat images? And was there this kind of sacredness of images? Did they use images at all in worship? Did they use images in such a way that veneration was not just an option, but a necessity in the church? Which is essentially the position that the Eastern Church ended up eventually taking. And as I read through the early apologists in the church, so, Athenagoras, Tatian, Justin Martyr are, kind of the big ones. There are plenty of others as well. I mean, reading Tertullian and Irenaeus too. But as I read those figures, I noticed that when they were dealing with paganism and they talk about Christian worship, they tend to make it a point that God does not need to be worshipped by images, as the pagans are saying. And of course, I don't know that anybody says that God needs to be worshipped in that way. But then they go on to say and Christians don't even have any images in our worship, and we don't need images at all, and we don't adore images. We don't bow down to images. So that kind of rhetoric or argumentation shows up a lot, at least in the very early church fathers. So it does seem in the pre-Constantinian church, images are really rarely used in the worship space at all. Now, some of that, of course, is just going to be, historically, in terms of just plausibility, you're meeting in catacombs or in people's homes. It's not like you have money to build elaborate basilicas and with a bunch of beautiful images. So some of that is just kind of circumstantial. But as you read through each of those texts, it also does seem to be apparent that Christians are saying that we specifically don't venerate images as part of our worship. And that's pretty universal. That you find in the early church. In fact, I don't really see any early examples of anything else, and that's what Dr. Ortlund is pointing out in his particular video. So I think that he's right in the basic argument that he has here, and historians see this. I mean, you don't have to be read anything on iconography, read anything about scholarship surrounding the Second Council of Nicaea and leading up to the Second Council of Nicaea, because at the time that I had at least done the reading on this issue, I couldn't really find anyone who was really arguing much otherwise. So that's not to say, however, that there were no images in worship ever. Images did show up somewhat in early Christian worship. They increased, especially in the post-Constantinian church, which again, some of that's just circumstantial because they could. So they could worship publicly and not necessarily just have to hide. So that makes sense that they would be doing that. But as you look at some of those images, first of all, they're very different. So they're not like Eastern icons. They tend to be more signs and symbols than anything else, more than certainly not objects of kind of religious veneration. They tend to be things like, well, there are drawings of, say, the Good Shepherd. And this also kind of looks like Hermes, so there's a bit of a play, I think, on Jesus and Hermes, that Jesus is the true Hermes, but that's kind of another discussion. And you see a lot of stories of the Old Testament that are depicted in particular. A lot of it's kind of, as I said, symbolism. So they use like Moses striking the rock. The rock was Christ, as Paul says. So it's not a clear image of Jesus that shows up everywhere in the way that we think about like crucifixes in our churches. It tends to be, or like Jonah. Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah. So you have these Old Testament stories, even some kind of connections with some Greek mythology to give signs and symbols of truths of the Christian faith. So images seem to have a very different function when they first show up than they end up having later within the history of the church. So what I want to say regarding this is the conversations that I would love to be able to have real conversations about this question, because I think it's an important question, and I don't fall on the Reformed side of things. I'm a Lutheran, so I use images. I have images. Our churches have images. We pretty much have crucifixes all over the place. like as Lutherans, we have images of Jesus everywhere, and I love images of Jesus. I have icons, and I think they're useful and helpful. However, I would distinguish the use of images from what's called, the adoration, kind of religious adoration of images. So I wouldn't fall on kind of either side of that debate if you're talking about the iconodules or iconoclasts. There was an article that was just put out that Davenant just put up on their website. It was brief. I thought it was pretty good. I read it this morning, and it's an argument that I have made in the past that essentially it's the Carolingian position that Lutherans end up taking, that says that images are very helpful didactically, which certainly the sign symbol kind of stuff that we see in the earliest Christian images I think demonstrate that. But it's useful didactically. It's useful in helping kind of set up a worship space. Clearly, there can be, according to the Old Testament, you've got images in the temple. You got the Holy of Holies. You've got the cherubim. So there's a sense, I think, in which images can be beneficial and good in the church, but stopping short then of that kind of religious veneration that you find developing, especially in the Eastern Church in the early medieval period when this first starts to show up. But something that I think is really frustrating in some of these conversations is anytime you have dialogue, say with Rome, you put out a video to say the early church didn't agree with Roman doctrine. Here's point A, B, C. Show me something else. Because that's kind of what you want in a good debate, is like, I'm showing you that they believe this, you show me counter evidence. And that's certainly how things worked in the post-Reformation era. I much more enjoy reading Roman Catholics from that era in some ways because it's just kind of clear cut. They're like, no, the fathers did agree with us. And Lutherans are like, no, the fathers did agree with us. And the Reformed are like, no, the fathers did agree with us. And they can all actually have like this debate. What did the fathers teach about this or that? But nowadays, these conversations are so formed by the development hypothesis. I mean, Newman's development hypothesis becomes such a frustrating point of discussion. Because in some ways, and I've thought this as I've delved into all these historical issues, and I'm like trying to, talk about things like, for example, I spent time in the Augsburg Confession article dealing with communion in both kinds, which I think is really important, and because I think that's a clear instance of a break with unanimous history on Rome's part in the late medieval period when communion is only offered in one kind. But when I do videos like that, the response is always the same from Rome, and that is, but it's just doctrinal development, which means that you kind of can't even have a conversation, because anytime you ever discuss anything in the Fathers, it's always, we're the same church as the Fathers, and the Fathers always agree with us, except when the Fathers don't agree with us, we just say doctrinal development, so it still doesn't support the Protestant position. The frustrating thing about this is that it makes the Roman position unfalsifiable, and I've said this over and over again, because there's no way to prove it wrong. Like, there's no way to have a debate, there's no way to have an argument, because it's the Fathers agree with us, and when they don't agree with us, it's doctrinal development, so it doesn't matter that the Fathers don't agree with us. And so, like, what do you do at that point? And I think that this whole conversation, and again, I didn't watch the entirety of the Jimmy Akin Trent Horn video. I watched part of it, and I got too frustrated that I'd like things that those guys have done in other ways. And I, spoke with Jimmy Akin, and we had that conversation on justification, which I appreciated. I also found it very frustrating in other ways. But there is a kind of like slipperiness with the argumentation. I don't think that there's anything that I could show, or that Gavin could show, or that anybody could show in the early church fathers that would prove Rome's claims wrong, according to Rome. Like nothing. Like hypothetically, there's nothing. Because there's always just going to be the claim of doctrinal development. So just want to point that out as we're looking at some of these conversations, is I would really like to actually just see the sources debated. But we can't do that because it doesn't matter if the sources agree or not in this way. It gets a bit frustrating. But this then leads to one other comment that I want to make regarding this, because people ask me all the time, regarding Lutheran positions on images. and I want to say, and maybe I should do something on Nicaea too. I probably should do a program on that. Because again, we don't find ourselves in the Reformed position, certainly, but we also don't find ourselves in the kind of veneration view of things either. I think when you read John of Damascus and read his argument from the Incarnation, I think theologically John's argument is basically right in many ways, but at the same time, I don't think that it leads to veneration. And maybe that's a weird position to take. But I'll say, as Lutherans, we're very incarnational in our theology, like in our Christology. We very much affirm that the infinite expresses itself in and through the finite, that there is a kind of exaltation of the finite through the infinite, so that there's an exaltation of the humanity of Christ through the hypostatic union, that the sacred is displayed and given in physical matter by physical things. This is why we're so sacramental. And I think this plays part in our view of vocation and God's, and as Luther talks about human persons being masks of God that he uses to work in the world, this intimate tie between God and the world, that God works, and the transcendent is found within the physical limited realities of physical stuff in the world. And I think all of that fits very well with John of Damascus's argument. And in some ways, so I'm kind of conflicted on this issue when I read, people in the East, because I want to agree with a large portion of what they're saying, but at the same time, I don't see a biblical argument. I simply don't see a biblical argument for images as something to use in the context of veneration. In fact, I see when images are used in a worship context, depending on how, but if specifically we're talking about veneration, you have to define that too. It's used in the negative. And then when I look at the examples of the history of the church, it seems that kind of veneration of images also is not prominent in the early church. So I do move away or shy away from Nicaea II, at least in its fullness, in the way that it develops in the East. But anyway, I'll probably develop these thoughts further and explore this. It's an important topic, and I'm glad that the discussion is happening. So I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in there. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel and check out the other videos. God bless.